Very little is known about SEIFER'S past, but what we do know about him is that he was born 18 years before the events of Final Fantasy VIII, and during what was called the Sorcerer's War, where the sorceress known as Adele declared war on the world in his quest for world domination. It was during this war that SEIFER would lose both of his parents and would be sent off to live at an orphanage run by Adia Kramer, who looked after not only SEIFER, but other children who had also lost their parents during the Sorcerer's War. Due to his own insecurities, SEIFER would spend his early childhood bullying the other children at the orphanage, and at the age of 7, SEIFER along with many other orphan children would be transferred to Balam Garden, where they would be trained to join an elite mercenary force unit called SEED. Over the next 11 years, SEIFER would train to become a member of SEED and would develop a fierce rivalry with fellow SEED trainee Squall Leonhardt. After one of their many sparring matches, SEIFER would cut Squall across the face, giving him a scar, but Squall would immediately retaliate by slashing SEIFER across his face, giving him a similar scar. After recovering from his injury, SEIFER would be paired with fellow SEED trainees Squall and Zell to take part in a SEED field exam to the city of Dalat. Despite being placed in charge of his team, SEIFER would abandon Squall and Zell in order to fight off every enemy that he could find, and when the retreat orders were given, he would abandon his team once again to return back to the beach landing zone all by himself. This would cause SEIFER to fail the exam and not graduate to become an official member of SEED. After failing the exam, SEIFER would go on to leave Balam Garden and go on to attack the president of Galbadia and take him hostage. It was at this moment that the SEED team comprised of Squall, Zell, Selphie, and Christus would arrive at the same time that Sorceress Adia would appear and offer SEIFER to join her, which was an offer that he would ultimately accept. Believing that he had discovered his new purpose in life, he would join forces with Sorceress Adia, acting in mind as the sorcerer's personal bodyguard. SEIFER would be present during the SEED team's attempt to assassinate Sorceress Adia and would go on to battle them but would ultimately be defeated. After the failed assassination attempt, SEIFER would continue to serve under the influence of the sorceress from the future who is known as Ultimacia, and would take part in not only the assault on Balam Garden, but he would be successful in raising the structure known as Lunatic Pandora, and would go on to kidnap Renoa and attempt to offer her as a sacrifice to Ultimacia in a body of the new host Sorceress Adele. After Squall and his allies were successful in defeating Ultimacia, her influence over SEIFER would disappear, and he would eventually return back to Balam Garden where he would be reunited with his friends. Genesis's birth was the result of one of several experiments part of the Jenova project orchestrated by Dr. Hollander. His genetic mother was injected with Jenova cells while he was still in the womb, which would grant Genesis unique abilities that were believed to have come from an ancient race of special humans that had the ability to communicate with the planet itself. After Genesis's birth, Dr. Hojo would use this template as a starting off point for the Jenova Project S experiment, which would ultimately lead to the birth of Sephiroth, who Dr. Hojo deemed was the superior specimen. During his early years while he was living with his adoptive family, Genesis would befriend Angiel, and many years during the Wutai War, Genesis would come to envy Sephiroth because of his fame as a legendary warrior, and would eventually leave with Angiel to Midgard to become a member of Soldier. Genesis and Angiel would eventually elevate themselves to the rank of first-class soldier, which allowed him to become Sephiroth's only friends. During a training exercise, Genesis would suffer an injury that he assumed would heal, but unfortunately, this injury alone triggered Genesis's flawed genetic structure to begin to break down. Dr. Hollander informed Genesis that he could heal him, but instead wanted to use Genesis to get revenge on Dr. Hojo to prove that Genesis was the superior Jenova Project specimen. Under Dr. Hollander's command, he convinced Genesis to take the main force of the 3rd and 2nd class soldiers to go rogue during the closing days of the Wutai War. Sometime after that, Genesis informed his long-term friend Angiel that with him being one of the results of the Jenova projects, that his body too would begin to break down, and convinced him to also go rogue, causing him to turn on his young trainee 2nd class soldier Zack Fair. After Angiel's defection, Zack would be promoted to first-class soldier, and together he and Sephiroth would be ordered to hunt down Genesis, Angiel, and the original creator Dr. Hollander. After months of tracking down the two, Zack would eventually go on to kill Angiel, taking possession of Angiel's Buster Sword. Despite the loss of Angiel, Genesis would continue to work with Dr. Hollander. However, while Sephiroth and Zack were on a mission to a Omega reactor in Nibelheim, he would tell Sephiroth the truth behind his creation and that of his mother Jenova, and the events that would eventually cause Sephiroth to spiral into madness and would cause him to want to destroy everything. But his plan would be halted by Zack, who, with the aid of a young infantryman named Cloud Strife, would actually go on to defeat Sephiroth. With Angeal dead and Sephiroth gone, Genesis was all that was left of the original Jenova projects. 4 years later, Genesis's body continued to break down, and he would learn that Dr. Hojo had used Zack Fair and Cloud Strife for his experiments, and had injected both of them with the same cells that were used to give birth to Sephiroth. With this knowledge, he believed that the cells within Zack's body could be used to cure him, only to find out that Zack's body had actually rejected those cells due to the fact that he had already been injected with a different form of Jenova cells earlier on in his life. This left the now non-responsive Cloud Strife as the only one who had the cells that Genesis would need to survive. After killing Dr. Hollander, Zack would be directed towards a cave where Genesis was waiting for them, and he would leave Cloud outside the cave, and as Zack entered the cave he would engage Genesis. Within the cave, Zack would find Genesis in possession of a powerful materia that he believed had been given to him by one simply known as the Goddess. Absorbing the power of the materia, Genesis would transform into a great beast and would engage Zack, but would ultimately be defeated in battle. After Genesis reverted back to his human form, he would be cured of his sickness, only to be struck down for the final time by Zack. With his final defeat, Zack would carry and leave Genesis' body outside the cave and would leave with Cloud on their way to Midgard. After Zack and Cloud had left Genesis, he would be recovered by Shinra forces, and though Genesis does seem to have an appearance after the events of Dirge of Cerberus, Genesis' final fate remains unknown. Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian to the 3 Topics Game. We're here to present the first Final Fantasy focused matchup for Versus Series Season 6. Now, I must say, I'm actually really excited to revisit this kind of matchup because just like my Squall versus Cloud matchup I did a while back, we will be pitting a member and product of C Training up against a member of Shinra's Elite Soldier class to see which one of these two combatants would come out the winner. Now, before I begin, I would just like to state that when it comes to my information on Genesis, I will be taking it directly from my matchup that I used with Genesis against Nero, simply due to the fact that there has been no new information on Genesis since that video was released. And when it comes to Seifer, I will be using him as he was during the final battle that you have with him in Final Fantasy VIII. Now, if you do happen to enjoy this matchup by the end, I would really appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up, and please do not forget to subscribe and press that notification bell to keep track of me and all of my future matchups and video projects for this channel. So, with all that out of the way, let us begin my analysis by comparing these two fighters physically. During the events of Final Fantasy VIII, Seifer was an 18-year-old human male standing 6'2" and was a relatively large combatant with a very muscular build. His years of training to become a member of SEED developed him into an effective fighter wanting to prove himself, and because of that and his own disdain for the ideas of teamwork, Seifer worked hard to build himself up so he wouldn't need to rely on his teammates. While he had a physical build that would have been perfectly suited to fit a strength-based fighting approach, he nevertheless spent a great deal of time working on his speed, and because of that, Seifer had a great deal of stamina and could continue to fight for long periods of time, and his years of training also granted Seifer a great amount of durability in combat, so much so that Seifer has shown that he can continue to engage Squall and his allies in multiple engagements in a short period of time, and would even continue to fight while injured. Despite his well-developed physicality, Seifer is still just human, and being only 18 means that he has not reached anywhere near the peak of his physical prime, and still has a way to go. But even at this early state of his development, he can certainly provide a legitimate challenge to most combatants that he encounters. By the time of his final battle against first-class soldier Zack Fair, Genesis was a 25-year-old human male standing 6'2", and was well into his physical prime as a member of Shinra's elite group of first-class soldiers. Like all members of Soldier, thanks to the Jenova cells within his body, he was granted superhuman levels of strength, speed, stamina, reflexes, endurance, and durability. His strength was sufficient enough that he could match that of his genetic superior Sephiroth. He is shown to be able to jump great distances and heights with also very little effort. His speed and reflexes were developed enough to allow him to not only engage and defeat entire armies of enemies, as for the standard that would be for first-class soldiers, but also allowed him to go one-on-one against Sephiroth in one of their many sparring matches. However, Sephiroth may not have been fighting at his full potential, simply wanting to test out his combative skills, but that's only speculation. His levels of stamina were exceptionally high, however I do believe that this would have been greatly decreased over time due to the nature of Genesis' genetic degradation. This was shown as he was physically exhausted over the course of his final battle against Zack. His endurance and ability to take damage during a battle was certainly higher than the lower class levels of soldiers, though Dr. Hojo made it perfectly clear that Sephiroth was the overall superior and genetically more stable specimen than Genesis, which to me overall as a combatant puts him clearly ahead of second class soldier Zack Fair, but lower than other combatants like Sephiroth and Final Fantasy Advent Children Cloud Strife. Despite his ranking with all of those in the higher class levels of soldiers, he is still proven to be a challenge to his superiors and would certainly overwhelm his inferior combatants. This round is pretty easy to call. Seifer is certainly a well-built combatant, but he is simply outmatched physically in every single department. Genesis is faster, stronger, more durable, with greater reflexes and physical feats to support his combative performance. While Seifer has spent 11 years building himself up to be the best combatant he can be, Genesis was genetically engineered and was given superhuman levels of physical performance to make him a one-man army, which is what the higher ranks of soldiers were developed to be. He may not be on the same level as a superior specimen like Sephiroth, but he's powerful enough to compete, while Seifer would certainly experience major difficulties right from the get-go. The only thing that might help Seifer in a physical sense is the fact that Genesis' genetic structure is not as stable as it needs to be, and because of this, his combative performance will ultimately end up slowing down if placed in a long-going engagement, which would encourage Genesis to have to finish the fight as quickly as possible and not take part in a battle of attrition. But due to the size of gap between Seifer and Genesis in a physical sense, I find it highly unlikely that in a head-to-head engagement like this, that the fight would even last that long. So for these reasons, I'm granting Genesis the edge in physical capabilities. Being trained to become a member of SEED granted Seifer access to a very unique style of magical output. Most members of SEEDs were unable to learn practical uses of magic that they could generate within themselves, but instead would actually use a unique ability called Draw to actually drain quantities of a specific spell that they then could use within themselves. This Draw ability was possible by attaching what was called a GF or Guardian Force to a user, which would then give them access to this technique. However, something I realized during my research is that as you continue to fight Seifer throughout the game, there are certain magical spells that you are actually able to draw from Seifer when you fight him. So while officially he shouldn't have access to the ability known as Draw, it is clear that he is somehow getting access to these spells through an unknown source that I've just not been able to discover. So while Seifer will not be able to officially use the ability of Draw, I'm going to give it to him anyway for this particular matchup just to give him a little bit of help. However, he does have access to a number of other spells that he can use in this battle. He does officially have access to the 4 magical spells of Firiga, Thunderga, and Blizzaga in Aura. While Firiga, Thunderga, and Blizzaga are all elemental spells that are pretty common in Final Fantasy, the spell of Aura is noted to be very rare in the world of Final Fantasy VIII. It increases the chances of a combatant being able to use what is called their limit break attacks in battle, and speaking of limit breaks, Seifer has access to only one limit break attack called Fire Cross. This attack begins with Seifer casting a powerful fire spell at an opponent, stunning them, which will then leave them open to a following up attack thanks to the use of Seifer's Gunblade. It was actually this very limit break attack that you see Seifer use against Squall at the very beginning of the game, which caused Seifer to give Squall his scar. Seifer's collection of magical spells and abilities makes him a pretty straightforward combatant to put all of his focus on offense, and while he is certainly not the most powerful user when it comes to his magical abilities, he still should not be underestimated. Like most members that go into Shinra's soldier program, though Genesis was undoubtedly skilled with his use of magical abilities, he was far from being exceptionally powerful in the art. Genesis was proficient with use of basic magical spells that would have been universally taught throughout all of the trainings of the soldier program, but his higher levels of magical and special abilities allowed him to develop into a unique form of combatant in his own class in order to closely resemble that of what would be called a red mage. By the time of Genesis' final battle against Zackfair, his primary combative special attacks were Twister Strike, which allowed Genesis to jump in the air and spit his blade in a cyclone formation to close the distance between himself and his opponents. Dancing Sword was a quick barrage of furry speed strikes. Magic Sword allowed him to fire a wave of energy-generated swords to surround an enemy and attack them from all angles. Flash enabled him to fire off a collection of projectiles at an opponent to home onto their special ability. And a second form of this ability allowed him to use energy projectiles that then Genesis could then guide onto an opponent's immediate position. But Genesis' most powerful ability was his Apocalypse Blast, which allowed him to summon a massive wave of concentrated energy to cause massive amounts of devastation damage to immediately wipe an entire area clean. But this ability was very label intensive and took some time in order to actually use, therefore Genesis would not really want to use this in open battle. On the defensive side of his magical abilities, Genesis was known to have developed very basic magical barriers that could reduce the damage of basic magical spells that were used against him. However, they would be proven useless against much higher powerful magical spells. Thanks to Genesis' genetic makeup, he was also granted the ability to unveil a single black angel wing which granted him flight for great mobility. In a whole, Genesis was nowhere near being a top-tier master in the art of magic and would spend his life searching for the means to possess greater power. However, his flexibility and creativity allowed him to use his limited set of abilities to maximum effect to present a serious threat to most opponents. This is one of the rare times where I went into a certain department thinking that one character would have the advantage, but once I did some research, the opposite result ended up becoming true. From the beginning, I really believed that SEIFER'S use of the draw ability would help him gain access to Genesis' entire collection of magical spells. But what I discovered about the draw ability is that it does have limits. It only works on universal spells that are not exclusive, which explains why you cannot use this ability to draw certain spells that some of the bosses in Final Fantasy VIII can use exclusive to them. The spells that SEIFER could draw from Genesis are the kind of spells that not only does Genesis have no interest in using, but SEIFER already has them. Genesis absolutely would be able to use the spells like Firegut, Blizzagut, and Thundergut, but just chooses not to use them and instead relies on his exclusive spells and magical abilities that he himself has developed, and this puts SEIFER at a huge disadvantage. The only spell in SEIFER'S arsenal that would be of any use in this battle would be his Aura spell, which would then grant him access to his Fire Cross Limit Break attack. And while I'm 100% sure that SEIFER would be successful in hitting Genesis with this attack on the first try, SEIFER would then try to attempt to spam this attack over and over again, and this time Genesis would be ready to avoid it. And once the Aura spell starts wearing off, if SEIFER attempts to use it again, he would just be telegraphing what his next move is going to be. Genesis, on the other hand, may have a limited number of special abilities and attacks at his disposal that he tends to cycle through, but most of them are unavoidable and you simply have to endure their attack and keep fighting. And since SEIFER does not have the superhuman levels of durability that he can fall back on, it wouldn't take too much for these attacks to start wearing SEIFER down quickly. What you have here is a combatant in SEIFER who has a powerful collection of magical abilities at his disposal, but his magical abilities will be of little use, and will do nothing but allow Genesis to quickly adapt and take over the fight, and once Genesis begins to start getting his magical offense going, his limited collection of magical abilities will be shown to be much more effective and can put SEIFER under the kind of pressure that his physical condition simply will not allow him to sustain for a long period of time. And because of that, Genesis will get the edge in magical and special abilities. SEIFER'S primary weapon was a Gunblade model which was dubbed the HYPERION. Unlike Squall Leonhardt's model, which was built mainly for power, SEIFER'S model was designed for speed. The weapon itself measured at about 3.5 feet long, and as opposed to other models of Gunblades, the handle was made out of a semi-automatic pistol. And while the idea of attaching a blade to the end of a gun may sound stupid, and many people consider this to be a stupid looking weapon in general, the overall design did have a practical use. The handle of the gun allowed it to fit better into the palm, allowing SEIFER to have much better control of his weapon when SEIFER attacks. The trigger mechanism was designed to fire a shockwave through the blade as SEIFER attacks, thereby doubling the attack impact without SEIFER having to use his own strength to do so. Thanks to the model of gun that was used as the handle being semi-automatic instead of a revolver based, I believe that this allowed SEIFER to use this firing mechanism much faster than Squall. Due to the Hyperion's blade design, it is clear that this weapon was best used as a slashing and piercing weapon like a fencing sword, and was not best used for hacking attacks like other models of gunblades. The metal that was used to create the blade is unknown, but whatever was used must have been extremely tough, as the Hyperion has shown to be able to block fully dedicated power blows head-on without breaking. Genesis' primary sword was named the Rapier, and it was described to be a crimson broadsword with a rapier-style hilt, and the overall weapon measured at about 5 feet long from the butt of the handle to the tip of the blade. The unique function of the Rapier was that it allowed Genesis to infuse the blade itself with magic, which allowed him to increase the amount of force that Genesis could apply with his power blows. In a whole, Genesis' Rapier was a very simple weapon that served all of Genesis' combative needs in just about any engagement that he would come across. When comparing the Hyperion to the Rapier, it is clear that both Cypher and Genesis share a certain mindset when it comes to their choice of weapons. Both weapons are built for speed, but the only advantage that the Rapier has over the Hyperion is its length, which grants the Rapier a 1.5 foot blade length advantage. But the idea of fencing for both of these combatants is to keep their distance, and because of this, I believe that Genesis' early, more subtle approach will not really play a major factor in this department. Both weapons have the capability to incorporate power-based attacks, but in order for the Rapier to use power blows, Genesis has to channel the blade with his own magical power, and he can only do this for a limited amount of time, while Cypher can use power attacks by simply pulling a trigger. And the fact that this weapon comes with a semi-automatic design for the Hyperion's handle, Cypher will certainly be able to dish out more power attacks at a much faster rate. Overall, while the Rapier is indeed an effective weapon and works perfectly for Genesis, in order for it to be used at its most effectiveness, it needs an external source of power. But just like Count Dooku's curved handle lightsaber, the Hyperion is designed to be user-friendly and enhance the effectiveness of Cypher's own specific fighting style, and because of that, I'll be granting Cypher's Hyperion Gunblade the edge in weapons. Like all my previous matchups that I've done over the course of my Versus series, including sword users, I will be using lightsaber fighting forms to better illustrate and describe the martial and tactical approach of these two combatants. So with that out of the way, as someone who spent 11 years training to become a member of SEED, Cypher had proven that he was one of the most effective individual fighters in Balam Garden, and his rivalry with Squall made that all the more proven. Being Squall's rival, Cypher as a fighter was determined to not follow Squall's path, but to follow the opposing path as a swordsman. Since Squall determined to follow the proper direction that members of SEED should follow, Squall developed himself into becoming the most effective power duels that he could, wanting to be the spear tip of his team's offense, while Cypher decided that he wanted to dedicate himself into not wanting to rely on his help of his allies and focus on his individual strength and focus on being a dedicated speed fencer. Because of this, if Cypher were to study any one lightsaber form, then there's no question that the form he would have chosen would be Form 2 Makashi. Makashi was designed for blade-on-blade combat and relied on speed, precision, and the manipulation of the blade to produce the greatest class of pure swordsmen. Because of Makashi's focus on blade work, it was never encouraged for the user to apply much energy into their attacks and focus on their footwork and efficient defense to rely on the manipulation of their blade and attack any exposed weak points, no matter how small they were. Makashi seriously lacked in the strength department, but thanks to the design of Cypher's Hyperion Gunblade and the inclusion of the firing mechanism, this was an aspect of combat that Cypher could use without compromising the traditional fighting style. When it comes to Makashi's defensive maneuvers, instead of attempting to take an attack straight on, Makashi encouraged the user to use the edge of the blade to perform a deflection parry against an upcoming attack, which would leave an opponent open to an immediate counterattack, and we do see Cypher use this against Squall. Despite Cypher's years of training with this particular fighting style, I do not believe that Cypher developed his skills enough to incorporate the use of feints, binds in order to work his way through an opponent's defense. Cypher was focused on waiting for his opponents to leave openings rather than trying to create them himself. The Makashi form was typically weak against more strength-focused forms due to its lack of kinetic energy, but I believe that Cypher's many sparring matches against Squall over the years would have prepared him for this kind of weakness, and the only way that Cypher's skills with the sword would fail him is if he encountered an opponent who could apply much more strength and pressure than Squall ever could. During the final years of the Wu-Tai War, Genesis would eventually be recognized as an elite member of Shinra's Soldier First Class faction. His envy of Sephiroth and his desire to become a legend like him would inspire Genesis to become a master swordsman in his own right, eventually being ranked second only to Sephiroth himself. Due to his physical enhancements and his tendency to always prefer to take an offensive approach in his attempt to overwhelm his opponents, Genesis would have been trained to be a practitioner in Forms 4 Ataru and Form 5 Shien/the Gem So. But surprisingly, his approach to combat would not suggest that Genesis would have wanted to study Makashi, despite the fact that both his weapon being designed for such a form and his idolization of Sephiroth's specializations in the forms, but perhaps this was done to give him his own identity and not simply be seen as a pure copycat. Ataru was known as the aggression form, and its entire moveset required the user to stay constantly on the move, allowing one to apply a high velocity of attacks in an attempt to overwhelm his opponent's guard or attack an exposed vector. However, Ataru's high level of combative movements made the practice of this form extremely exhausting, burning through a user's stamina, making a focus with this form very unreliable for a solo long-term engagement. However, due to Genesis's enhanced physical properties, he was granted superhuman levels of stamina, which would allow him to keep up the assault for a much longer period of time. The Shien variation of Form 5 would have served Genesis very well against firearm-wielding opponents, while the Gem So variation of Form 5 would have been known as the Perseverance form, and not only was it designed specifically for blade-on-blade combat, but it relied on using defensive movers and then immediately counterattacking with a powerful offense. Form 5's only weakness was that due to its focus on strength, it lacked mobility in a close quarters range. However, this again was a weakness that Genesis overcome thanks to his physical capabilities. As a battle tactician, Genesis could be described as a progressive aggression fighter. Like most combatants, he would start off with a basic probing offense, but once he had a solid idea on his opponent's skill level, he would then simply go all out with every attack that he could in an attempt to overwhelm his opponents. Now, though to most this would seem like a good strategy, but what Genesis lacked the most was any sort of tactical foresight or reliable fallback option in the face of overwhelming odds. Genesis's first, second, and only response is to go all out with everything he has, and when that is not enough, his offensive approach can be rendered useless. As swordsmen and martial combatants and battle tacticians, both Seifer and Genesis are highly skilled when it comes to what they can do as combatants, but there is simply no question that Seifer is completely outclassed by Genesis in just about every single way. Seifer has spent 11 years trying to develop himself into becoming the kind of combatant who can stand polar opposite to Squall, and while Seifer should be commended for developing into an effective fighter, he unknowingly ended up engineering his own combative flaws without knowing it. Seifer's only combative experience was against Squall, or up against small groups of uncoordinated enemies. But as a speed fencer, he has not had the opportunity to test out his skills against another speed fencer, and has shown to experience extreme difficulty against coordinated offensive opponents that have the flexible offensive capabilities. He has put all of his skills into one kind of approach and suffered from what Count Dooku described as enslavement to form. Genesis, on the other hand, not only has spent more years training and developing his skill set, but he has been granted far more actual combat experience in a multitude of different combat scenarios. When one takes into account just what members of Soldier were trained to be, as they were meant to develop into becoming one-man armies that could be dropped into just about any combat scenario and deal with it on their own, it also helps that Genesis enjoyed having a superior quality of training partners to develop his skills against. All Seifer had for years was Squall, who was a singular, dedicated power duelist who developed at the same pace that he did. But Genesis not only had Angel, who was also a dedicated power duelist, but he had the GOAT himself, Sephiroth, as a training partner. Genesis, Angel, and Sephiroth were all friends for many years, and the sparring match that we witnessed in Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core was only one of many that the friends had participated in over the years. And thanks to the genetic enhancements that the three had, it allowed them to develop their combative skills and capabilities at a much faster rate than the average human. This also allowed Genesis to be much more flexible as a combatant, and would only experience difficulties when facing an opponent who could either match his physical combative performance or could exceed him. For many years, Genesis was openly recognized as one of the most effective members in Shinra's soldier class, surpassed only by Sephiroth himself, who he himself was a prodigy combatant. While Cypher would be able to stand his ground in the early stages of the fight, once Genesis got going and started putting some serious pressure on Cypher, there's not much that he could do because he has never faced an opponent who could fight with the level of flexibility or intensity that Genesis would bring against him, and it's because of these reasons that Genesis will get the edge in martial skills and as a battle tactician. From the beginning, I really believed that this matchup between Cypher and Genesis would be quite interesting. I have stated to many people who have commented on my Cypher vs Sephiroth matchup back then that it should not be taken too seriously, and the purpose back then was to make the fight between those two sound more exciting than it really was. And my purpose back then was also to test out my own analytical skills, but even I've recognized that a fight between those two would absolutely be a slaughter in Sephiroth's favor, with the fight literally being decided in a matter of seconds. So pitting Cypher against someone who's certainly below Sephiroth would mean that this fight will play out as a full engagement. It still does not change the reality that Genesis would certainly win this fight in the end. Unfortunately for Cypher, he is simply nowhere near physically suitable to provide a challenge, his magical options are severely limited, and as a swordsman and battle tactician, he has neither the training, combat experience, or tactical flexibility to pose any serious threat to Genesis, even if Genesis was in a weakened state as he was in his final battle against Zack Fair. A perfect visual representation of how this fight would play out would be the duel between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, with Cypher playing the role of Luke and Genesis playing the role of Vader. The early stages of this fight would start out slow, with Cypher and Genesis getting a feel for each other's skill level, and after a short period of time, Genesis would recognize that he is clearly the superior swordsman. Like Sephiroth, he might get a little cocky and begin to start lightening up his offense in an attempt to toy with Cypher. Wanting to change things up, Cypher would then cast a few elemental spells or even attempt to draw some magic spells from Genesis, but this would end up being non-effective as Genesis has experience against these spells. Cypher would then use his aura spell and initiate the Fire Cross Limit Break attack, and he would be successful in hitting Genesis, delivering a serious hit on Genesis, ultimately winning the first round. However, this early victory would end up backfiring on Cypher, as this would do nothing but piss Genesis off, who recognizes that he left himself open by taking the fight too lightly, and would respond by cycling through all of his magical attacks. Because Cypher does not have the physicality or magical defensive capabilities to respond, he would take hit after hit and begin to be worn down. As we enter the final stage, Genesis would go all out with his sword power offense in an attempt to overwhelm Cypher, and while Cypher has had experience against power-focused assaults like this, thanks to his sparring matches against Squall, Genesis is attacking with far greater strength and ferocity, and Cypher is now in a weakened state thanks to the magical assault that he just went through, and is unable to withstand Genesis' offense, which would ultimately cause Genesis to cut Cypher down, ending the fight right then and there. I declare Genesis, the Black-Winged Angel, the winner. And that'll do it for my first Final Fantasy focused versus series matchup for the season. I hope you found this video informative and also enjoyable to listen to, and do you agree that Cypher is simply outclassed by Genesis as a combatant, or do you believe that there's an unknown factor that I may have overlooked that could help Cypher pull out a surprising victory? Share your thoughts with me and everyone else in the comments down below, and like always, remember that this video is just my own personal opinion, so don't feel too bad if Cypher happens to be one of your favorite Final Fantasy characters. Thank you guys for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and keep track of me on all my future video projects and future matchups that will be coming out over the course of the season. And like always, here's a quick preview of my next Versus Series matchup, and you probably won't have to wait very long to see it. So, I'll catch you all next time.